Thank you to WWF-Korea for inviting me to address today's Climate Action Conference. We have all watched with horror as events in Eastern Europe have unfolded in recent weeks following President Putin's unprovoked attack on the Ukraine. But if you cast your minds back a few months, you'll remember as I do that 2021 was a year in which the world was galvanized to tackle a very different type of crisis. Through the UK-hosted G7 and COP26, world leaders, including President Moon, provided assurance that they would take the key steps required to tackle the climate crisis. As a result, 90% of the global economy is now covered by net zero commitments. And significantly, enhanced NDCs from the US, EU, Japan, Korea and other major emitters signal a much greater commitment to action in this critical decade. The Glasgow Climate Pact, the concluding summary notice of the formal COP26 discussions, is an expression of the collective ambition of all parties to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. Whilst the formal COP26 meeting has concluded, the UK is decisively not taking the foot off the accelerator as we urge climate ambition globally. Firstly, because we are fully embracing our responsibility to lead a full year of climate diplomacy as part of our COP26 presidency, and there are still 8 months to go until that ends and we hand the baton to Egypt. But more importantly, because our ability to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius whilst within reach is challenging and fragile. That is why all parties agreed to language within the Pact to revisit their NDCs in 2022, as well as to take immediate action this decade to vastly reduce emissions in key sectors such as power, industry and transport. The urgency here is driven by the science. Time is quickly running out to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We need to halve emissions in the next decade. The latest findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, announced just over a week ago, were clear that we are already being impacted by climate change to a greater degree than previous assessments suggested. And the science the IPCC make clear is that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will substantially reduce climate risks. The case for proactively managing this risk is perhaps the most important consideration I would ask you to take away from today's discussions. Especially as you ask yourselves what the Glasgow Climate Pact means for your businesses and organisations. Let's go back to the scientific basics. The more emissions we pump into the atmosphere today and over the coming decade, the more that temperatures will increase. And with every fraction of a degree that temperatures increase, the greater acceleration of risk for stakeholders across society. The risk will be to our physical assets in the face of more extreme and more frequent weather events and to rising sea levels, and to profitability as our economies, in the face of inaction on emissions, progressively miss the opportunity to participate in the orderly transition to a net zero economy, which it is in all of our interests to see. That is why there are growing calls from financial decision makers who run the global economy for businesses to take action now. Many of you in the audience today are leaders in business and/or finance. You know better than I how to manage the risks facing your future profits and your responsibilities to shareholders and to stakeholders. But I can say that in the nearly 4 years in which I have served as the Embassy's Economic Diplomacy Councillor, that I have been heartened to see the significant steps the Korean business sector has taken to manage the transition to the net zero economy. To name but a few examples, Shinhan Financial Group last year announced clear plans underpinned by science and Paris-aligned temperature trajectories for how they would decarbonise their investment portfolios to net zero. Major corporate entities such as LG Electronics have science-based net zero targets. SK Rent-A-Car committed to EV100 and a transition of their 200,000 strong rental fleet to zero emissions vehicles by 2030, whilst 15 Korean corporations are now committed to RE100 and powering their operations only via renewable energy by 2050 and in many cases sooner. These, I would suggest, are excellent examples of Korean companies proactively managing the inherent risk to transitioning to a net zero world. In this COP26 presidency year, we want to see more of this type of action, because in 2022, making net zero statements and RE100 commitments is not about branding. It is firmly about your business adopting a corporate strategy to enable you to remain competitive in this challenging new economy we all face over the next 30 years. I say this because there is now a clear body of evidence to say that we have hit a global tipping point in the transition to the low-carbon economy. Tipping points are important, for most new technologies are adopted slowly in the first instance. But studies have regularly shown that once we hit a certain amount of demand, growth is exponential. Take a look at the power sector. In 2021 alone, China connected over 100 gigawatts of renewable energy, broadly equivalent to Spain's total generation capacity. China has also just overtaken the UK to become the largest offshore wind market in the world, after the huge addition of capacity in 2021. And these are just two examples of many that we are seeing globally. This change is being driven by governments at both the national and subnational level who recognise that it's in the interests of their economies to speed up the energy transition. It is also being driven by businesses who are now demanding access to renewable energy sources, and by consumers who want clean air and to reduce their contribution to the present and future climate crisis, which will affect the lives of their children. And it is not just the power sector where we can see these transitions taking place. Global consumers are now switching en masse to zero-emission vehicles. There are around 9 million now on the road, double the size of the global fleet in 2019. Estimates indicate this will double again in the next 18 to 24 months. And by 2040, Bloomberg predict there will be 677 million zero-emission vehicles on the road globally. This is not typical year-on-year growth. In both of these examples, we see exponential growth. This is led by states and companies who are seizing the opportunity to win new markets and overhaul the established supply chains which have led the fossil fuel economy of the last 100 years. And this growth poses a challenge to all existing business models grounded in the technologies of the 20th rather than the 21st centuries. In recognition of this new level of ambition, the world's leading economies signed up with the confidence to the breakthrough agenda at COP26, common goals for 2030 to make clean and zero-emission power, road, transport, hydrogen and steel the common and most cost-effective options in all markets. And through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, well over $100 trillion of private sector capital is now committed to funding this ambition. If this finance can further galvanise key sector transitions, our hopes of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius remain possible. So, in speaking to you today, I want to remind you all that the progress made in Glasgow, to which many of you contributed, is both positive but fragile. We need actors from across all sectors of society to proactively manage climate risk. And we can only continue to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach if there is action now in this critical decade for implementation. I therefore have 3 recommendations for you all to consider today and in the future. 1. Firstly, to back your innovators, especially those who are now beginning to lead the transition to a 2050 net zero economy. The economic case for domestic energy security, the type only renewable and other low-carbon sources can provide in most geographies, is growing, especially as we watch events in Russia unfold. 2. Secondly, to prioritise above all else the deep emissions mitigation activity which we need to continue to see across all sectors of society and industry, and which the spirit of Paris and Glasgow makes clear is required. All sectors of society need credible plans to hit net zero by 2050 underpinned by science. Whilst using the finalised Paris rulebook, including the new rules on carbon markets, to complement but not substitute for, the deep mitigation action which science tells us is required by our major emitters. 3, and finally, to continue to engage with the newfound and welcome prominence of the ESG agenda, but with a scrupulous determination from each of you that the E in ESG must be defined in line with the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact. Thank you for listening to me today.